in Padua maybe 4 years ago for a conversation about anticipation. So I feel like I know that Max and I have been in conversation about these issues for a long time, but I've also had the privilege of talking to some of the people at Padua about politics, time, and history. So I'm also grateful for having the occasion to write something I've been planning for a while, which is to step back from the last book I wrote called Freedom Time, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and elaborate some of the theory and method that guided me while I was writing it, and that is also helping me think about new research I'm doing now on Black radical humanism in the Atlantic world. But time failed me. I have a long draft of a very rough and messy paper, but no nice, clean presentation. So what I'm going to do is say a little bit about the first couple of sections of the paper that I wrote, that this deadline pushed me to write and gave me an opportunity to write, which is both old issues that are familiar to me, but also a new formulation and a new argument. So I'm very happy to think with you about it and take questions. Let me say a little bit about the moves in the first part of the paper and the overall objective, and then I will read one section that comes towards the end that kind of sums up in a programmatic way what I am trying to talk about when I refer to an untimely history of the present. So my point of departure in the paper is to recognize the importance and power of Michel Foucault's conception of a history of the present, but I also try to identify some of the crucial limitations, especially with regard to temporality, of the genealogical method that guides his understanding of history of the present. I won't go into genealogy. People here know what genealogy is. We can talk about that. But certainly, in all kinds of ways that we are familiar with, Foucault's genealogy, his concern with challenging essences and challenging those who would chase origins, does challenge many of conventional history's temporal assumptions. Genealogy is very important in overturning the norms of traditional history, insofar as it's anti-foundational, anti-progressive, anti-teleological, anti-objective, anti-scholastic. I could elaborate on any one of these. And above all, Foucault's genealogy is critically self-reflexive. It recognizes that the analytic concepts that historians use to explain the world were made by the world, and in many cases, made by that world. It insists that scholars are implicated in the processes they study. It rejects knowledge for knowledge's sake. And Foucault reminds us that a history of the present based on genealogical inquiry needs to be linked to current struggles. The point of it is that it can help intervene in the present in a certain kind of way. That's why he talks about effective histories of the present and producing effective histories of the present. So it's not about judging the past by present standards. It's not the presentism that we historians are endlessly warned again, but it's a matter of engaging the past in order to judge present norms in a certain way and challenge them. But in this first part of the paper, I suggest that despite challenging traditional historical assumptions about tradition, heritage, continuity, transition, progress, teleology, all that good work that genealogy does, Foucault does not historicize time, and he does not problematize the present of his history of the present. So I do suggest, by looking at some of his writings about genealogy, which I won't go into here, that he writes as if historical events take place in time as a neutral medium, and he does not treat time itself as a historical force. He traces genealogies of normalizing social arrangements, but does not recognize how temporal norms themselves often mediate social domination. His concerns about continuity, essentialism, determinism, and teleology, so his fear of slipping into any of these modes of thinking that he rightly contests, but his fears of essentialism or continuity or determinism or teleology, I show in certain moments, lead him to again and again insist on this categorical distinction between past and present. He warns of anachronism. He rejects the idea of an active past or persisting past active in the present. And he, again and again, in his writings on genealogy and history of the present, and his later writings on the historical ontology of the present, always insist on the singularity of the present, the singularity of the current epoch. So while we know that Foucault teaches us so powerfully that social actors and processes are not identical with themselves, he does tend, however implicitly, to treat the present as a self-identical now. In certain ways, his genealogy challenges the idea that history moves in a straight lineal arrow, but although he shows us twists and turns, reversals, breaks, and ruptures, that historical movement is still lineal in genealogy in a certain way. It is still, right, it's not a straight line, but it is a kind of line that moves in an irreversible direction from past to present. Now, my kind of argument at the beginning of this paper is that if social domination is mediated by temporal arrangements, and if the present is not identical with itself, and I'll say more about that, and I know we will for the next 2 days, then an adequate history of the present, and I take seriously Foucault's invitation that we do a self-reflexive, ethically implicated, politically engaged history of the present. I think that is exactly what historians, philosophers, critics should be doing. But if these propositions about temporality and the present are true, then an adequate history of the present does have to historicize time and problematize the present. It has to also recognize the non-synchronous or untimely aspects of social life, which I don't see in Foucault's writings about genealogy. Now, interestingly, okay, I got 10 minutes to set it up before I start reading. Good. Interestingly, as we also know, Foucault kind of sets up what he means by genealogy and the importance of genealogy by calling it a local criticism, which he counterposes to what he calls totalizing theories with scientific pretensions. Mostly he's referring to semiology, to psychoanalysis, and of course, above all, to Marxism. And we know that Foucault is a great reader of many texts and not a great reader of Marx. And he tends to reduce Marxism to Orthodox Marxism, Third International Orthodox Marxism. For him, it's vulgar materialism, it's economic determinism, and historical teleology. So everything that the virtues he ascribes to genealogy are often framed in specific counterpoint to Marxism. And I don't have to tell this group here, but part of what I say in the paper, and this discussion of Foucault is just the starting point, is that paradoxically, ironically, in fact, Marx's writings and the tradition of heterodox Marxism offer very important theoretical resources for writing a temporally self-reflexive history of the present. So again, it's not in order to kind of counterpose in some simplistic way Marx and Foucault or throw out the history of the present, but to say, look, if we want to realize the promise of the history of the present, we need Marx, or at least the current of Marxism that many of us in this room have been thinking about. So in the long paper that I have, just in a minute or two, I kind of rehearse some familiar moves, which is that Marx, of course, one way to read all of Marx's writings is to read them as a reflection on the relationship between politics, history, and temporality, or social formations and temporal frameworks. He shows us the mutually constitutive relationship between abstract clock time and capitalism, capitalist accumulation. That is not new. He demonstrates what I would call the dialectic of social formations and temporal frameworks, that they kind of, that certain kinds of societies presuppose and produce certain kinds of time, and that the kind of, that social domination, as I said, is mediated by temporal arrangements. So what that means is that Marx immediately shows us that time itself is a historical artifact. He historicizes temporality. It's not natural. He shows us that time is a real abstraction, using his language, though he doesn't say. He shows us that almost in every paragraph of volume of Capital, for example. He doesn't say time is a real abstraction, but we can understand him that way. He certainly shows us how abstract clock time becomes second nature. So he historicizes time in that way, but and he shows us the naturalization of the relationship between history and time as clock time. But when we read Marx's work, he also shows us how under capitalism, precisely that naturalized abstract time is constantly denaturalized. Because he shows us that the history of the struggle over the working day, for example, is a struggle over the very definition of units of time. He shows us whether it's through the generalization of competition and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. He shows us how he gives us an account of constant acceleration under capitalism in creative destruction and the crisis-prone tendency of the system, in the cycles of boom and bust. He also shows us that historical temporality under capitalism is stop-start, it's disjunctive and disruptive. They're all, I can say more, but there are all kinds of ways in which Marx also reminds us that that capitalism itself produces a very untimely experience of social life. And I then go on to give a set of examples of how Marx's writings offer all kinds of insights into the untimely character of modern social life. Certainly in the kinds of repetition Oliver was just speaking about in the 18th Brumaire, just going kind of quickly here, in that great early letter to Arnold Ruge, when he talks about subjective consciousness, and he says it's not about a dividing line between past and future. I'm just kind of referring to kind of reference points that most of us are familiar with. He insists that it's not about this dividing line between past and future, but carrying out thoughts of the past. I speak briefly about how this is not, that untimeliness for Marx is not only subjective, but objective. So in the introduction to the Grundrisse, he talks about the ruins and elements of vanished social formations whose partly still unconquered remnants are carried along with it. In the first preface to Capital, he speaks of, he reminds Germans of the passive survival of antiquated modes of production with their inevitable train of social and political anachronism. I'm sure I will not be the only one to quote that in these 2 days, that persist within a more developed capitalism. Of course, in the 1843 introduction to his contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, he specifically speaks about Germany as an anachronism of German capitalism, as incorporating within itself these earlier forms of economic and social relations, but he also talks about the untimely way in which Germany is philosophically advanced and socioeconomically behind. Certainly, I would direct, though I don't have to direct people here, I would direct people to Max Tomba's and Harry Haratunian's writings about primitive accumulation and formal subsumption, which show us not only that capitalism is able to accommodate these different modes of production and forms of life, but actually with their own distinctive temporalities, but actually is constantly producing those differences and needs to produce those differences, so that capitalism is a kind of matter of this kind of endless play between producing untimeliness and then trying to synchronize untimeliness. And Max's work is extraordinary and important in that regard. I briefly talk about Tomba Haratunian and Kristen Ross's recent writing on the archaic Russian commune. And of course, I'm just going to jump forward. And then the last example I use is the wonderful discussion of Greek art in the introduction to the Grundrisse, where Marx does not only tell us that there is a relationship between social arrangements and aesthetic possibilities, and he shows us that the kind of non-capitalist conditions and mythic consciousness that produced Greek art, that was able to produce Greek art, no longer exist under capitalism, under a disenchanted modern world. But he's interested in the fact, he's not just reducing a kind of a type of aesthetics to a type of social formation. He says, but how is it that this Greek art continues to speak to us across generations? In this, he doesn't use untimeliness, but in this untimely way. How is it that it still seems to be what we aspire to, not just aesthetically, but humanly? It represents a kind of life that is incredibly appealing, even though the conditions no longer exist under which such art is possible. And he, of course, tells us that it allows this glimpse into the childhood of humanity, right? The childhood of humanity, and possibly a glimpse we can extrapolate into a non-capitalist future. And of course, at the end of that discussion, Marx says, what is true of art is even more true of societies. So in these different ways, through these different examples, Marx is suggesting that the relationship between an alienated present and an emancipatory future may be mediated by the past, right? The past may mediate the relationship between present and future. And of course, we know that that aspect of Marx's thinking was developed by heterodox Marxists in subsequent generations, especially by Ernst Bloch and Walter Benjamin. And there's a way in which Marx is very attentive to non-synchronism and untimeliness, but as much as I derive inspiration for thinking about untimeliness in Marx's own writings, it is also the case, I would suggest, that Marx tends to be more concerned about the oppressive and alienating aspects of untimeliness, and he's often pushing to kind of separate past and present, or produce a more normal temporality that is less oppressive. Both sides of that are the case in Marx, but I would say that Bloch and Benjamin pay special attention to the emancipatory possibility of untimeliness, though we know that Bloch is very attentive to how things could go either way. So now I am going to kind of read this section based on that, where I talk about, in a programmatic way, with 4 propositions about what do I mean by an untimely history of the present. So the whole point is that based on these readings of Marx, Benjamin, and Bloch, that I'm not going to go through here, that gives us the resources to loop back around to Foucault's original invitation to write what he calls effective histories of the present, but now we can do it on different ground. And I'm suggesting that we need to do it by, again, historicizing time, problematizing the present, recognizing the untimely aspects of social life. So the kind of big argument in this paper is a call for what I am calling an untimely history of the present. So now I will move into programmatic mode. So first, First, any history of the present should reflect critically on the concept of the present. This means treating every past as an untimely now that, as Bloch suggested, condenses within itself objective arrangements and subjective orientations from disparate historical epochs. Understanding a non-identical now that is traversed by different kinds of time means recognizing that social life is shaped by processes of duration, ongoingness, repetition, reenactment, and haunting that challenge conventional historiographic understandings of agency, causality, context, event. We could go on. We need, in other words, to explore how subjects' relations to themselves, to others, and to the world, to social orders, are often mediated by unrealized hopes, outmoded utopias, failed struggles, collective traumas, uneven development, etc. This means taking seriously traces and specters, aftermaths and afterlives as social facts and historical forces, and it also means attending to how consciousness and practices may not align with epistemes or epochal norms. Jacques Rancière argues that such anachronies, this non-alignment between consciousness or practices and epochal norms, are not only ubiquitous in social life, but that they provide the very conditions of possibility, of critique, of political action, of social transformation, of history itself. Practices of repetition, reenactment, and conjuring are often unconscious expressions of individual or collective subjectivities, but social actors may also repeat, reenact, remember, or conjure intentionally and strategically in order, for example, as Benjamin invited, to interrupt an oppressive historical continuum. So I'm suggesting that an untimely history of the present pays attention to this untimely aspect of social life. But my second proposition is that this kind of history of the present should examine in a more specific way. The next step is how an untimely now may articulate itself in specific way with particular past epochs, whether through what Bloch called non-synchronous contradictions or Benjamin called historical constellations. Such constellations, Benjamin suggests, may be discovered or constructed by social actors, or discovered and constructed by social actors. They may point in reactionary or revolutionary directions. And I am suggesting in the second proposition that we need not only to trace the various portals that open and channels that flow between such linked epochs, but we should also attend to the emancipatory possibilities that may be opened or foreclosed by these untimely formations or constellations. We may thus examine how persisting, recurring, returning, or conjured traces of unrealized past possibilities may remain somehow present or available within a non-identical present. Temporal contradictions may create political openings. Residues, legacies, or memories of less alienated forms of life and unrealized utopian visions may provide critical perspectives and everyday resources for transformative struggles in the present. Bloch thus invokes what he calls the gold-bearing gravel of previous labor processes and treasures of a not quite completed past that express what he calls unfulfilled intentions for and concrete expressions of more cooperative forms of work and sociality, or integrated forms of sociality that have not yet been destroyed by capitalism. Similarly, Benjamin credits the surrealists for perceiving what he calls the revolutionary energies that appear in supposedly outmoded objects, but also in places and arrangements. Benjamin praises their ability to, quote, bring the immense forces of atmosphere concealed in these things to the point of explosion. Benjamin identified this kind of untimely energy, or what he calls now time, in and through, as we know, profane illumination, dialectical images, arrested monads, historical constellations, etc. Thus, Benjamin writes about blasting past epochs out of the continuum of history. We know he talks about the tiger's leap into the past as a revolutionary act, and he speaks of revolution in terms of pulling the emergency brake of the train of runaway history. He writes, quote, every historical moment offers a revolutionary chance whereby the political situation provides the right of entry into a distinct chamber of the past, which up to that point had been closed and locked. So again, The point is the specific constellations between one untimely now and another untimely now may be an important kind of object of study or process for an untimely history of the present. Now, there certainly exist important differences between Bloch and Benjamin. I don't have to tell the people here that. Bloch, who called for sustained and determined work that would be required to link non-synchronous contradictions to current struggles, and Benjamin, for whom every second offered the possibility that collective action might effect revolutionary rupture. Bloch was more concerned with completing the past, and Benjamin with redeeming the past. We can extend these differences, but I bring them together here to suggest that both, in contrast to conventional history, start from the fact of an untimely now. Both recognize that the movement from an alienated present to an emancipatory future may need to be mediated by a past that has not passed. Critical of one-sided attempts either to retreat back to the past in a straight line or to march straight into the future, each of them rejects both revolutionary romanticism and progressive reformism. They are equally critical, of course, of the sequential historicism of professional historians and the teleological historicism of Orthodox Marxists. As Bloch reminds us, he writes, obviously the entirety of earlier development is not yet sublated in capitalism and its dialectics. World history is a house that has more stairways than rooms. Capitalism is not the only house in history that could be dialectically inherited. A quote that I think Tomba is also fond of and we have spoken about. And of course, Benjamin figures every second of now time as the straight gate through which the Messiah might arrive. So equally critical of sequential history. So in short, I would suggest that Bloch and Benjamin both attend to what critic Michel Levy, if I pronounce that correctly, calls in a very useful way the dialectic of past and future, which Levy identifies with the tradition of what he calls revolutionary romanticism that he traces through Marx into Bloch and Benjamin and beyond into other thinkers. So revolutionary romantics do not just look backward with nostalgia or dream of recreating a past golden age. Levy explains that they seek in the past glimpses of and grounding for a new society that is yet to be created. So Benjamin's Tiger's Leap does not simply transport actors into the past, but blasts open homogeneous empty time in order to constellate aspects of the past with aspects of the present in revolutionary ways. So revolutionary romanticism is not romanticism as we tend to think of it. And Bloch invites Marxists to reclaim lost forms of pre-capitalist wholeness and liveliness, those are his terms, for current struggles and visions. But he also warns Marxists against believing that such ideals were ever adequately realized in past social formations. He thus speaks of incompleted intentions and uncompleted pasts. So my way of reading this, I would suggest that the insight of revolutionary romanticism is not so much that we have lost a human emancipation that actually existed in past forms of life, but that we have increasingly lost the conditions of possibility for pursuing or even imagining such human emancipation. That as Benjamin notes, the very forces of material progress have been agents of social regression. And Bloch reminds us that these unrealized past possibilities only become politically effective if linked directly to new revolutionary forces and possibilities that the contradictions of capitalism is currently creating. This is why he calls on Marxists to master the dialectic of synchronous and non-synchronous contradictions, to link what he calls uncompleted past to impeded futures. So this, in any case, I'm going to skip forward also a little bit. This way of thinking, this way of kind of trying to engage the dialectic of the past and the future, is what I tried to do in my book, Freedom Time. My last book, I don't use that language to explain what I was doing, but I do use Bloch and Benjamin extensively to try to analyze the critical thought and interventions of Aimé Césaire from Martinique and Léopold Senghor from Senegal on political futures during decolonization, where they had an untimely vision of self-determination without state sovereignty, and they tried to reconstitute the French Imperial Republic as a transcontinental and multiracial democratic and socialist federation. So in the book, I treat the immediate post-war moment as an untimely present in which unrealized past possibilities were conjured by historical actors. For example, I analyze how Césaire's projects, first for departmentalization and then for cooperative federalism, were mediated respectively by the spirits of Victor Schœlcher and Toussaint Louverture. I suggest that Césaire implicitly constructed a historical constellation between his now in the 1940s and 1848, and then later between his now in the 1950s and the 1790s. Césaire spoke to his predecessors as contemporaries and insisted on the ongoing actuality of Antillean slave revolts and metropolitan workers' insurrections. He, like Senghor, looked to still vital elements within non-identical Caribbean, African, and European traditions that exceeded themselves and pointed beyond their actually existing arrangements. They sought residues and resources for more poetic ways of knowing, for less alienated ways of being and modes of relating to oneself, to others, and to nature that they believed had been developed in various ways by all of these traditions, but were destroyed by modern European capitalism, imperialism, and instrumental reason in ways that now made them unavailable to all people. So these poetic and integrated ways of being were once more widespread and were now lost to all people. So this is a kind of revolutionary romanticism that is not simply a critique of one civilization from the standpoint of another. They looked not only to traditions of African communalism, oral literature, to black aesthetics and anti-imperial revolt, but also to the imminent possibilities of the pre-Socratic Greeks, the early Christian church, 19th century socialism, European modernist poetry and philosophy. So again, I suggest in the book, and I'm suggesting now, that we read them also as revolutionary romantics, whose critical orientation, in fact, had deep affinities with and some concrete relations to the heterodox Marxism of not only the German Jews that I've mentioned, but figures like Henri Lefebvre, and then later on Raymond Williams. So in a new, I'm going to skip forward again a little bit here. In a new research project, I am trying to situate Césaire and Senghor's radical humanism within a broader Black Atlantic critical tradition and political orientation that actually links thinkers in Africa, Caribbean, Europe, and the United States. So far I've worked mostly on W.E.B. Du Bois and C.L.R. James, who also, I would suggest, attend to this dialectic of past and future. I suggest, for example, that we read Du Bois's Black Reconstruction not only as a critical genealogy of Jim Crow, but as an untimely way of working through a series of political predicaments facing Black communities during the Great Depression. Conversely, we may read Du Bois's contemporaneous program for a new type of Black mutualism through autonomous social cooperatives as an untimely attempt to realize in a new historical opening the possibilities for multiracial socialist democracy that had been briefly made possible but then foreclosed in the 1870s. So Du Bois is implicitly constructing a constellation that linked his now in the 1930s to the uncompleted possibility of Reconstruction in the 1870s. More well-known is C.L.R. James's way of regularly linking Black anti-imperial struggles in his now of decolonization to the long-term history of Pan-African revolt. More specifically, he regularly triangulated his political present, the Haitian Revolution and the Russian Revolution. His writings about one were almost always refracted through and mediated by and carried traces of the other two in that kind of untimely operation. He regularly treated both Lenin and Toussaint as contemporary interlocutors. And perhaps less well known are the ways in which James also constellated his Caribbean now, the now of decolonization, when he was confronting the problem of freedom with the ancient Greek polis, which he wrote about extensively in terms of the possibility of a certain kind of good life in the Caribbean in the 1960s, or the glimpses he saw in cricket play or in whaling work, as figured by Herman Melville, for more integrated, fully human ways of life. So in their different ways, Césaire, Senghor, Du Bois, and James produced their own versions of an untimely history of the present, or untimely histories of the present that identified in seemingly outmoded traditions, vital traces of, and resources for less alienated arrangements. So this brings me to a third proposition. An adequate history of the present needs also to be temporally self-reflexive. So this means that recognizing that address the untimely character of social life. 2, attend to the ways in which an untimely now may be constellated with a past epoch in politically productive ways. Now, the third proposition is a call for temporal self-reflexivity on our part, which means recognizing that our own present, the historians or critics' own present, is an untimely now that may be connected to or may need to be deliberately constellated with unrealized pasts that may provide energy and insights and resources for struggling towards an emancipatory future. Recall that Bloch used the language of the left's obligation to grasp non-synchronous dialectics. And Benjamin evokes the secret agreement between past and present generations, with the past endowing the present one with that weak messianic power, which is really about an ethical obligation and untimely answerability for and to predecessors. So in my Freedom Time book, I also I was not just writing about how these actors in the 1940s were thinking through and acting through the refractions of 1848 and the 1790s, but I too was trying to construct a constellation between that post-war moment and our own post-Cold War present, pointing to affinities between their political predicaments and ours, and to how their attempt to dissociate self-determination from state sovereignty, their attempt to link autonomy and interdependence, their attempt to link self-management and human solidarity may speak to the challenges of our political present and the prospects of post-national democracy or translocal federation or a new left internationalism today. I too tried to address these predecessors as contemporaries and to hear their address as if they were speaking to future interlocutors. So after finishing the book, I can speak about the many people writing about history, politics, and time that informed my own thinking while I was writing the book. But to my delight, I discovered towards the end of the Freedom Time book, when I met Max, certainly, that I seemed to be working in parallel ways or along similar lines as other scholars, some of whom are here in the room today, and specifically in relation to the Marxian tradition, that this dialectic of past and future that Lovie speaks about seems to be also in the work of, for example, Max Tomba's important book on Marx's temporalities, where he writes, "There is something of the future," great quote from Max, "there is something of the future encapsulated in the past that can be freed from the contemporaneity of the archaic." I wish I had had that quote or knew about it before I wrote my book, but I do now, and it will inform my work as I go along. And of course, it's an ongoing conversation because Tomba elaborates just this kind of insight in his new work on insurgent universality, where he traces how radical actors in 1793, in the Paris Commune, in the Russian Revolution, reactivated and refunctioned seemingly outmoded institutions like communal government or the imperative mandate in radical ways. In similar terms, Harry Haratunian has this terrific quote where he proposes, quote, a model of the present thick with different practices from other modes of production, mixed temporal regimes declaring their affiliation with different times now past, but still retained with their corresponding political demands. So this persistence of unrealized political demands from the past that may inform politics in the present. And in his recent book, Marx After Marx, Haratunian identifies this insight not only in Marx's writings about real and formal subsumption, but he traces its persistence in the work of peripheral and heterodox Marxists, not only Luxemburg, Trotsky, and Gramsci, but Jose Carlos Mariátegui in Peru, and Uno Kozo and others in Japan. And of course, we need to consider Kristen Ross's powerful and beautiful communal luxury book titled Communal Luxury on the Commune, Paris Commune, which demonstrates how Marx, William Morris, and Peter Kropotkin, by looking to past forms of life whose communitarian and democratic remnants may persist in the present, offer what she says, quote, is a way of allowing other paths taken through historical time, including the time to come to become visible. The persistence of non-growth driven cultures in the present builds confidence in the possibility of anachronism by allowing encounters in one's own moment with actually embodied aspects of the past, stranded or landlocked as it were, but still sporadically perceptible. It's this sporadic perceptibility that is kind of gives this point of political leverage. She also has a beautiful quote where she says, a parable is not about going backwards or reversing time, but about opening it up. Opening up the web of possibilities such that a vision of non-alienated labor and pre-class society may be placed next to contemporary times as a way of recruiting past hopes to serve present needs. So that's the critical operation again. Recruiting past hopes to serve present needs. I'm right at the end here. So common to our work, despite significant differences, is just this need to recruit past hopes to serve present needs. And Tomba and Ross also do not only trace this process in past actors, but they are writing effective histories of the present insofar as these examples may provide critical resources for thinking about the present. And finally, and this I think is what I believe Benjamin may have meant when he wrote about politics as the art of foreseeing the present, and what Edward Glissant, the Caribbean critic Edward Glissant, may have meant when he spoke of a prophetic vision of the past, another great formulation. And now finally, I'll conclude by offering a fourth proposition that is my least developed, but I want to put on the table for discussion, which is that an untimely history of the present may also be proleptic, analyzing the present as if it were distant history, seeking to envision what will have been as if from the point of view of future actors or critics who may one day try to constellate our now with their present, or their now with our present, however you want to put it. This optic could help us to identify, so an untimely history of the present, there's a different register of it, the proleptic, future-oriented one, which is to read our now as if it were distant history, to identify those openings in our current untimely present that may offer glimpses of future possible arrangements, to attend to the fissures and practices, anticipatory and experimental, in our present that are already being or will soon be foreclosed, that will have been decisive crossroads or fatal turning points, that need to be remembered or will have been forgotten. So again, this is the least developed of my ideas about the history of the present, but I do often read Marx's writings about the 18th Brumaire and the Paris Commune exactly in these terms. We might also think of Bloch's longer heritage of our times, of Marc Bloch's strange defeat, about Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, for example, in these terms. And I suggest that this non-genealogical optic of the future anterior may be another way of understanding Benjamin's injunction to foresee the present and Glissant's prophetic vision of the past. I will stop there and just say that I also kind of use this proleptic way of treating the present as if from the distant future in the ways I talked about the futurity of Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor in my book. And I'll just end by saying part of this is not only to kind of say genealogy and Foucauldian genealogy in the history of the present was quite powerful, but there are deep limitations to what it can do, and maybe we need to think less about genealogy and more about constellations. But in part, motivating this set of reflections or this programmatic call for an untimely history of the present is to also push against those kind of currents of flat-footed left realism that we are encountering today so often, or even left melancholy, that in a perverse way, through propositions about cruel optimism or being stranded in the present or ruined time, etc., perversely mirror neoliberalism's own triumphal propositions, albeit in a tragic register, about there being no future, no alternative, that in a certain sense the story is over. So I think we all share that concern here, but I am constantly struck, certainly in arguments I've had about the book I wrote and the book I am writing, about a kind of left anti-utopianism that I don't think serves us, this kind of allergy to political imagination and the kind of anticipatory and experimental ways in which historical actors are constantly acting as if. So, yes, I'll stop there. Thank you.